History Graduate Student Organization for hosting this conference. I've really enjoyed the weekend thus far, and I'm excited for the rest of the day. So as was stated, my paper is entitled Disenfranchisement and Demasculation, an Analysis of the Antebellum Colored Conventions. In 1838, mixed-race abolitionist Robert Purvis lamented over Pennsylvania revoking black male suffrage rights. Purvis described how when a distinct class of the community, already sufficiently the objects of prejudice, are wholly and forever disfranchised and excluded, they lose their panoply of manhood as they are thrown upon the mercy of a despotic majority. Purvis was one among many African American activists who discussed disenfranchisement in gendered terms. Indeed, through explicit and implicit rhetoric, these men often associated disenfranchisement with personal feelings of emasculation. In denying black suffrage, northern states precluded African American men from using the ballot to dismantle segregation, obtain job opportunities with better and equal pay, advocate against enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, and more. By restricting black suffrage and subsequently restricting control over these aspects of American society, states limited black men's legal and political power, which produced feelings of emasculation as expressed by these men themselves. Thus, the desire to overcome emasculation became a central motivator for antebellum suffrage activism. This presentation will briefly discuss scholarship on antebellum black masculinity before analyzing how the antebellum colored conventions reveal activists' association between disenfranchisement and emasculation. I will conclude by considering how this gendered rhetoric impacted women's antebellum suffrage activism. My analysis will hopefully provide an avenue through which historians can connect the histories of black gender dynamics with political activism. As more women became professional historians in the 1970s and 1980s, they advocated the utility of gender as a lens of historical analysis. In 1986, renowned historian Joan W. Scott adamantly argued that gender served as a useful category of analysis because it yields a history that will provide new perspectives on old questions. Despite proving the value of gender in historical study, historians did not begin to definitively argue that men too have gender until around the 1980s and 1990s. Up until then, historians often focused on men as representatives of their classes, their callings, or their nations, but not so much as gendered persons. Due to the relatively recent emergence of historic masculinity studies, historians have not yet developed a complete understanding of historic manhood. That said, scholarship has made extremely important strides in helping us understand how men defined masculinity throughout history. Historians such as William H. Becker and James Oliver Horton figure prominently in early discussions of how free, antebellum black men residing in the northern states defined masculinity. Becker identifies 4 traits of black masculine identity: self-assertion, vocation, independence, and black identity. Building on Becker, Horton insists freedom and equality are also traits of black men's identity, given that their hold on freedom was rather precarious in the antebellum North. Although identifying these traits has immensely contributed to historians' understanding of masculinity, I tried to step beyond definitions to explore how one's desire to embody masculine traits, to perform masculinity, motivated action. Of course, in order to do so, I must use these traits as a foundation. So for the purposes of this paper, I will focus on 2 traits of masculine identity. I'll focus on equality and provision for and protection of family. I will use these traits to exhibit how antebellum black men often associated disenfranchisement with emasculation because the denial of suffrage limited their capacity for equality and capacity to protect and provide for loved ones. So to begin with my evidence, documentation from the antebellum colored conventions provides phenomenal insight into this association between disenfranchisement and emasculation. My larger paper discusses examples of this in Connecticut and New York, but for the purposes of this presentation, to avoid repetition, I'm going to focus on Pennsylvania because the evidence really is similar across these different northern states. So a convention held in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in 1848 most explicitly details how Black men associated states' denial of suffrage rights with emasculation. The Harrisburg Convention published a call for action to the Black community entitled An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of Pennsylvania. This document stated, quote, "The state constitution, by disenfranchising us, has stricken a blow at our manhood. In waiting to advocate for enfranchisement would cause the continuous destruction of the dignity of our manhood." The appeal further describes how convention members wanted to sue for our rights as men in order to overcome the legislation crushing us and our children beneath its ponderous weight. This document explicitly states the humiliating effects of disenfranchisement and emphasizes how Black men believed that disenfranchisement not only affected them, but also their loved ones. Thus, in one call for action, this convention exhibits the association between disenfranchisement and feelings of emasculation as expressed by these prominent African-American antebellum activists. The sentiments expressed at the colored conventions, as these men termed them, of the 1840s were often echoed in the Black press. The Pennsylvania Freeman published an article in 1848 proclaiming that Black men are men, equal in rights to all other men, and this disfranchisement is a denial of their equal manhood that hurts Black men by destroying their self-respect and degrading them in the eyes of others. The North Star made a similar argument through a more pointed response to New York legislation. This legislation upheld a $250 property qualification for Black male voters while removing the qualification for white male voters in the state. So in a published letter to the editor of the North Star, a concerned citizen argued that this legislation degrades our manhood and belittles our more favored fellow citizens. The writer then called on the Black community to, quote, arise from their slumber and advocate for legal change. Evidently, convention documents from the 1840s are not alone in making this association between disenfranchisement and emasculation. Now, the colored conventions of the 1850s feature less discussion of disenfranchisement in favor of focusing on topics such as the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, emigration, and the territorial expansion of slavery. That said, activists in the northwestern United States tended to address suffrage rights, and when they did so in gendered terms as well. One example is a convention held in Alton, Illinois in 1856. At this convention, activists described how laws restricting suffrage and other rights to white society are paralyzing our energies and destroying whatever of manhood there remains within us. During the same year, convention members in Columbus, Ohio, wrote to the Ohio Senate and House of Representatives asking how Black men could defend and protect life, liberty, and property without the vote. These conventions reveal a continuing emphasis on disenfranchisement, humiliating Black manhood, and restricting a key tenet of Black masculinity, protecting and providing for loved ones, as we see the association between property, home life. Black leaders, newspapers, and conventions throughout the 2 decades prior to the Civil War evidently equated disenfranchisement with personal feelings of emasculation. In so doing, these men exhibited how disenfranchisement restricted Black men's equality and their ability to fulfill what they viewed to be their responsibilities as men. By framing the argument this way, the fight for suffrage became more personal for many Black men and led them to advocate for suffrage rights in gendered terms. Despite their efforts, Black men achieved limited success in generating local legislative change during the antebellum era. This is evidenced in 1860 New York, when the state proposed a constitutional amendment enfranchising Black men that subsequently failed ratification by extreme margins. As the Civil War waged, Northern Black communities turned their attention to other issues, such as debating Black military service. A book that just came out about this is Brian Taylor's Debate Over Northern Military Service. It's a very good book, highly recommend. So they turned their attention to these other issues, right? But as the Confederacy prepared to surrender, discourse connecting disenfranchisement with emasculation really resurged. We really see this in speeches given by Frederick Douglass and John Mercer Langston. Both Douglass and Langston called for the immediate, unconditional, and universal enfranchisement of Black men because enfranchisement would prove that they were no longer beasts of burden, but men. Despite these arguments and other assertions after the Civil War that military service earned Black veterans, quote, admission into the arena of true manhood by giving them the right to vote, the 15th Amendment was not ratified until February of 1870, and as we know, voter restrictions would persist for decades. This conversation begs an important question. Did Black men's association between antebellum disenfranchisement and emasculation cause Black men to oppose women's struggle for suffrage if they viewed suffrage as a masculine right? There is certainly evidence that, at times, certain Black men opposed women's struggle for equal rights, including suffrage. However, evidence does not prove that such opposition was linked to believing suffrage was masculine. Rather, opposition largely came from concerns over maintaining the established gender hierarchy. Historian Martha Jones, in her book Vanguard, reveals Black men's commitment to the antebellum gender hierarchy in her description of how Black men often resisted Black women's desires to hold community leadership positions. Jones also highlights how the Freedom's Journal published an article that insisted that a well-ordered Black society required that in all things women should remain subservient. Thus, some Black men opposed women's struggle for equality, but they were motivated more by a commitment to the antebellum gender hierarchy than believing suffrage was purely masculine. Of course, we must not classify all Black men as fiercely oppositional to women's equality, because there were Black men who supported women in their struggle for equal rights, most notably and most famous, Frederick Douglass. After attending the Seneca Falls Convention, Frederick Douglass reflected that there can be no reason in the world for denying to women the exercise of the elective franchise. Despite Douglass's support of women's rights, he argued that other men's opposition often rested on their commitment to the gender hierarchy. He delivered a speech to the International Council of Women after the Civil War, where he declared that those opposed to women's suffrage argued that the basic universality of man's rule over woman meant such dominance must be right. This portion of Douglass's speech reveals how some men opposed women's equality due to their commitment to a patriarchal gendered hierarchy. Douglass then addressed the argument that women do not need suffrage rights because their husbands can represent their political interests. In this same speech, Douglass refutes this by claiming, quote, "We can neither speak for her, nor vote for her, nor act for her," thus revealing his renunciation in this particular speech of men's ability to politically represent their wives. This brief discussion of how Black men reacted to calls for women's suffrage proves, of course, the danger of generalizing to label all Black men as either for or against women's struggle for equality in the 19th century. Furthermore, although a preliminary examination of evidence yields no proof that Black men opposed women's enfranchisement because they believed suffrage was purely masculine, evidence does prove that gendered rhetoric drove opposition in a different way. Indeed, this evidence reveals how some men's opposition to female equality and suffrage rights was shrouded in gendered rhetoric based on their commitment to the established antebellum gender hierarchy. This brief analysis of how Black men responded to women's activism, in conjunction with my larger discussion of how Black men associated their personal disenfranchisement with feelings of emasculation, reveals the extent to which gendered rhetoric influenced suffrage activism during the 19th century. This analysis ultimately exemplifies the analytical benefits of studying how gender identity motivated political activism. Thank you.